Hi, welcome back. So hopefully you watched the first video in the series, just getting introduced to P5.js, and I had a chance to play around a little bit with your first program, remixing the P5.js blank sketch through glitch. Now in this video, what we're going to be covering is we're going to continue to unpack some of the differences and the new syntax moving from Java into JavaScript. And we're going to start to explore our first generative idea. We're going to talk about randomness in this lesson. And in particular, we're going to be looking at randomness in the context of this program called 10print. So 10print is, as we've discussed in the lecture, is one line of basic code that generates this maze-like image like this on the left. And that one line became the subject of a book written by Casey Reyes and lots of other authors. This book is available for free, by the way. You can read the book as a PDF online without having to buy it. And the first chapter is pretty interesting. The whole book is worth a read, but if you're curious about this, please have a look. So today we're going to write a program. We're going to call it a generative tapestry. That's going to first basically replicate some of the functionality of this 10print basic program. And then at the end of the lessons, I'm going to be asking you for your code exercise to expand on it and put your own personal twist on this idea. Okay, so let's start a new sketch. So we're going to go and have a look at P5.js blank. And then we're going to create a new remix. We're going to wait for it to load here for a second. So the first thing we'll do is we're going to rename it. I'm going to call it Generative Tapestry. And we'll say inspired by 10print. Okay. And then we can just dive right into the sketch.js file. So we'll set a black background. We'll get rid of this circle. We don't need it. And I'm going to show the sketch by choosing the next to the code option, right? So we can see our code and we can see the outcome at the same time. Okay, so the first thing we're going to explore in this sketch is we're going to create a grid. Now, the grid is a really powerful sort of design tool. There's lots of interesting things we can do using grid patterns, and especially in a generative context, right? We can use the grid as our basic form, and then within the grid, we can make interesting things happen. Now, the concept behind 10print is this idea of a grid where in each cell of the grid, there's a chance that one pattern or another is going to get drawn, kind of like a coin toss, right? Or some randomization. And that results in some complex visual patterns from some very simple elements. So we're going to be building our 10print inspired P5.js program, and we're going to start by this idea of a grid. So because we're going to be making a grid, let's define the size of this grid. And we're going to create a variable. So remember, the keyword let is when I define a new variable. We're going to call that variable grid. And we're going to set it to 20 to begin with. So that's going to be the size of a single cell in our grid. And the reason we're making it a variable is that we'll see towards the end of this lesson, we're going to be able to change the grid size and really affect the outcome that we get. And because this course is about generative art, it's a good idea to get into the habit of creating variables for quantities so that we can then tweak them down the road and affect the outcome of the project. Okay, so this is going to be our grid size. Now, if we want to draw a grid, well, first we're going to set a stroke color. If we want to draw a grid, right, that's going to fill this entire sketch window, we're going to need some repetition. And for that, we're going to use for loops. So this is the other first kind of concept we're going to review here in this in the series. We're going to look at for loops, and we'll see how they're a little bit different in P5.js than JavaScript. They're pretty similar, but the main difference is we have to use the keyword let, right, instead of int for declaring our counter, because there are no types in JavaScript. So let's say we wanted, for example, to draw we're going to start with just columns, right? So we're going to draw some columns, and then we'll extrapolate from that and draw a grid. We're going to draw a series of rectangles filling the screen going from left to right. So we're going to create a for loop that's going to use a variable called x as the counter. And within that for loop, we're going to set an end condition. So as long as x is smaller than width, we're going to continue to repeat. And then at each step, we're going to increment x by a certain amount. And here we're going to increment x by grid. Then I'm going to open and close some curly brackets, and that's going to define the body of my for loop. So inside the for loop, we're going to draw a rectangle just to see that it works. We're going to use x, right, as our coordinate. Then we're going to use 0 for the y value. And then for the width of the rectangle, we're going to use grid. And then we'll make it fill the entire height of the window. Put my little semicolon. And I'm going to turn off the fill as well, because otherwise we just got a whole bunch of white rectangles and we couldn't see anything. Okay. If we made this grid by grid for the size, right? So 20 by 20, you can see that our for loop is drawing a row of little squares. Okay. All right. So if we want to do a grid, what we have to do is we have to take this idea here of repetition, right, and then nest it inside another for loop. So we're going to say this is the loop that's going to draw all of our columns, right? And then inside that loop, we're going to write another loop that's going to go through and draw all of the rows. Or sorry, this for loop is going to draw all the rows, and then this is going to draw the columns. So we're going to create another variable. We're going to call that one y. And y is going to repeat as long as it's smaller than height, and it's going to increase in increments of grid. And then inside the for loop, we're going to draw a rectangle at x, y. Okay. So now we have a grid. So this is a useful structure that you've probably seen already in processing. The idea of nesting for loops. So we have one for loop repeating another, and the end result usually it's some kind of 2D, right? 2D pattern where we have kind of a combination of x and y going from 0, 0, and then increasing by, we're increasing the x's, and then every time we increase the x, we also go through and repeat for all the possible y values. So this grid is being drawn, right, starting on the top here. It's being drawn from top to bottom. Then it moves over to the next column, then it draws all the rows, next column draws all the rows, and it just keeps repeating until it's done every cell inside the grid. Okay. So the concept of 10print is that as we draw each and every one of these little boxes, we're going to introduce some random elements. And there's many ways we could do this, but we're going to also kind of leverage this example as a way of showing you some of the interesting syntax we can apply with JavaScript that we cannot do in Java. Okay. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use push and pop to move the origin around so that the 0, 0 point is going to follow each one of those cells in the grid as we draw them. Now you may remember these from processing. They were called push matrix and pop matrix. And what they did is they saved the state of the origin and the canvas. So that included all the translations, right? All the rotations and scaling. And then they allowed you to save with a push and then go back with a pop. Okay? Now in P5.js, we have the same idea, except it's just called push and pop. Okay? So we don't have the word matrix in there anymore, just push and pop. And then here we could do something like translate the origin, right? And then draw a rectangle at 0, 0. So every time we're in a cell, what we're doing is effectively we're bringing the 0, 0 point, right, up to the up to that corner of that cell here, right, moving it along, right, to every corner of the cell. And the reason I'm doing this is that it's going to make our life simpler if we're trying to design patterns to live within each of these cells, if we can kind of treat them as their own little world, right, where the 0, 0 point is in the corner and the width and the height of a cell is our variable grid. All right. So push and pop, oh, just complaining about my indentation. Actually, this is a good time to point out a nice little feature also of glitch. Whenever your code gets messed up, which it will, unless you're OCD like me about formatting everything just properly, it still works, but the indentation and the formatting is all wrong. You may have noticed there's a lovely little button up here called Format This File, and this will format it and also give you some sprinkles, which are quite lovely. Okay. All right, so we could draw a rectangle, or do anything here that we would want to do within each of these little cells, now that we've translated the origin. So the next thing we're going to do here, and again, this is a choice, we could just start, programming our, using some randomness right here and some if statements. We're going to create a function that's going to allow us to keep the code manageable. Okay, so now that we've translated x and y to be the corner of our grid cell, we're going to write a function here. We're going to call it draw random pattern. So in JavaScript, when you want to create a function, which is another word for a command, we just use the keyword function. We give it a name. Then we put some parentheses. We're going to have functions with parameters. This one has no parameters, so we just leave it empty. And then we open and close some curly brackets. And then inside our for loop, we're going to say draw random pattern. And from now on, this is going to be the job of this function to pick and draw a random pattern inside each cell of our grid. So by creating functions, we can sort of start to split our code into smaller pieces. And that makes it not only easier to keep track of where everything is, but also it prevents it from just getting out of hand, right? Just having really long sections in that, nested inside for loops and lots of, nested curly brackets. It's very easy to get lost in that space. So whenever we're going to have some, kind of logical bits of code that make sense together, it's a good idea to just package them inside a function. So in here, it makes the code more readable as well. It's going to say, use these two for loops to make a grid pattern. Save the origin, translate to the corner of a grid cell, and then we're going to draw a random pattern. And of course, we haven't figured out yet what to put in draw random pattern, but now we have a place we can jump to in our file where we can start to further build on the code without having to, add complexity to this for loop inside draw. Okay, so just to see that this is still working, right? Inside draw random pattern, I could put, again, like my little rectangle. This time we're going to go 0, 0, right? Grid, grid. So it should look exactly the same as before. Okay. So the idea here is that we want to have different patterns that we can draw inside this grid. And because we're basing this off of 10print, the idea behind 10print is that the pattern could either be a / or a backward slash. So we're going to implement that and figure out a way to choose between the two. So if we wanted to do, let's say, like a forward slash, right? A forward slash inside this box here, we could use a line. I'm going to say line, and that's going to go from 0 on the X, and then grid. So we're going to start at the bottom left corner of a grid cell, and we're going to go all the way to the top right corner of the grid cell. So now we have lots of forward slashes, right, forward lines in each cell of the grid, and because it's always the same pattern, this is what it looks like. If we wanted to do the opposite, right, we wanted to do a line going the other way, we would go from 0, 0, which is the top left corner, and then we would draw a line to the bottom right corner, which in this case is grid, grid. So now we have a line going in the other direction. And now we have both lines. Okay, so now we have X's inside each of the cells. All right. Now, this function, we said its job is to draw a random pattern. So we're going to have to do something in here so that we're either going to draw that line or we're going to draw that line. And one way we can decide which one to draw is using the random function. Okay, so the random function, we're going to say create a variable. We're going to call it R for random. I'm going to say random, and then we're going to pick a random number between 0 and 1. Okay, we could choose any range here. We're just going to go pick a number between 0 and 1. Okay? So it's kind of like a coin toss, except we have lots of possibilities, right? When we get our coin back, it's going to be somewhere between 0 and 1. It could be 0, it could be 0.5, it could be 1, it could be everything in between. So if we want to do one line and not the other, we can look at that number and we can ask a question. We can say, let's look at the number random gave us, right, and make a decision. I'm going to say if R, so if we wanted to make this like a 50-50 coin toss, right, half the time we'll do a line, the other half of the time we'll do another line. We'll say if R is smaller than 0.5, right, because 0.5 happens half the time. If you choose a random number between 0 and 1, right, half the time you're going to be less than 0.5, and the other half you're going to be more than 0.5, because random is not biased, it's just completely random. And then we can add an else, so that if we're not drawing a forward slash, we're going to draw a backward slash. Okay? Now this is going a little crazy here on the right, because draw is draw repeats all the time, right? It's just constantly repeating. So what we're going to do is, for the purposes of this program, once we're finished with our one run through draw, we're going to add at the end here the keyword noLoop. Okay? And what that's going to do is just going to say, just do draw, right? And then once you run into noLoop, just stop, right? Just call it a day. And if we resize the window, we're going to get one more run through draw, but just once. Okay, so that allows us to see our pattern and just stop. So we're just kind of drawing one single frame, and we'll make use of that feature when it makes sense. If we want to, draw some intricate image but not constantly redraw it, this is an example of where this comes in handy. So no loop, basically stop, draw. Okay. All right. So you can recognize here the 10 print pattern. It's kind of similar here. We could play around with some of the parameters. Maybe I'll set the stroke weight to be a little bit bigger, right? It's the same idea. Now I have like thicker lines, thinner lines, right? And now that we've made grid a variable, we can also change the grid size, right? We can make this grid much larger, and our program will adapt on the fly. So template is really interesting because it's a really simple idea, just two possible patterns, a forward line or two diagonal lines. And what you get out of a random selection of these lines is just a lot of really interesting visual complexity. You get this like maze-like pattern that emerges out of this really simple little random idea. And yeah, so that's a really good example of a generative system. right? We've set up some rules here. We've said 50-50 chance you will draw one of two patterns. We set up some constraints, some parameters. We said we define the grid size and the colors and the stroke weight. And then every time we run this program, we're going to get a variation on that same idea. We can get an infinite number of variations using a simple structure. All right. Okay. So let's go a little further with this example. I'm going to make the grid a little bigger again. I'm going to show you another way that we could go about choosing these random patterns. That's going to be something that we could not do before using, we cannot do this before using JavaScript. Using processing and Java. This is going to take advantage of some of the flexibility built in JavaScript. Okay. So first, we're going to define a function, right? Two different functions for each of our two patterns. So we're going to create a function called pattern1, and we're going to create a function called pattern2. And inside these functions, we're going to put the line of code that is responsible for drawing our pattern. So notice I've taken out half of the drawing here, so I get an interesting result. I'm going to take out this other half. Okay. And then in the if statement, we're going to say pattern1 else pattern2. Yeah. And we're back to where we started. So now you might wonder, well, what's the point of doing this? We have the same result. Yeah? And well, as it stands here, there is no point. It is the same, in fact. But as you either have figured out already, or you will figure out the more you're programming, there's always more than one way to get to your end result when you're programming. And some ways are more flexible than others. Some ways are easier to tinker with than others. There's kind of different styles, different strategies you can employ to achieve the same result. And some of these strategies lend themselves a little bit better to creativity, I think, because they're easier to change and they're easier to build on. Okay? So this is what I'm trying to do here, is give you an example of how we could rephrase the same thing, taking advantage of some of the neat features that JavaScript affords us. All right, so we have here pattern1 and pattern2. Okay, so one of the interesting things about JavaScript is that because variables don't have a type, we can kind of put anything we want inside a variable, and that includes numbers and strings. But we can also assign a function to a variable. Okay, so here's what I mean. So for instance, we could say, let's make a variable. We'll call it the pattern. Okay. And inside this if statement, instead of calling the function that we want directly, we're going to say the pattern equals pattern1. And here we're going to say the pattern equals pattern2. Okay. And then once we've made our decision here with the if statement, we are going to use whatever we put inside the outcome. Right? We're going to call that function. So this is a really interesting thing. We cannot do this easily with Java. So we're saying, okay, create a variable, right? And in that variable, we're going to put a function. That's which function we choose is going to be dependent on what happens inside this if statement. So far, no difference, no change. Really, we're achieving the same thing. We've just structured it a little bit differently. And by making each pattern its own function, the other benefit we get is, like, down the road, for your exercise this week, I'm going to ask you to come up with your own patterns and kind of your own twist on that design. So it's going to give you like a self-contained little box here to think about each of these grid patterns in isolation, as opposed to having to take them apart from something like an if statement or other parts of your code. All right, so we can create variables that we can assign functions to. That's a really neat, powerful feature. That kind of means that our code will be able to almost like redefine what it does on the fly, because we can substitute, we can put any function we want into a variable Then we can call it like a function, like so. Now, so far this didn't really give us anything as far as clarifying, clarifying what we're doing here. So we're going to go one step further. So what we'll do is we're going to put all the possible patterns, and right now we have 2, but in the next example we're going to build on this. We're going to create more possibilities. We're going to expand the idea of 10 print a little bit. We're going to add 4 patterns and have more variation. We're going to take both of these patterns and we're going to put them inside an array. So now you may remember arrays in processing. They're lists of variables. They're like a place where we can store lots of variables at one. So in JavaScript, we can also create arrays, and the syntax is a little bit different from processing. So if you want to create an array in JavaScript, we're going to give it a name. We'll say our array is going to call, I'm going to call it choices. And then inside this array, we're going to have the choices are going to be pattern 1 and pattern 2. So I've created an array of 2 variables, right? And the first one is pattern 1, and the second one is pattern 2. So deleting this here for a second, we're going to get rid of the random portion, and instead of the pattern, that's kind of a dumb name, so we're going to call it chosen pattern. Okay, and here we're going to say chosen pattern. So now that we've put our patterns in an array, we can choose one by using the brackets, right? We could say bracket 0. Remember arrays, we have an index into an array. So this would give us the first pattern. Oh, chosen pattern. Okay. So this would be choices 0, right? Choices 1. So if you're, I'll point out to some resources and links as well. So if you need some brushing up on arrays and some of those concepts, I'll point out to some links to some separate tutorials on those ideas. But the idea is with the array, we can create a list of variables, and those could be numbers, strings, but they can also be functions in this case. Another nice thing that we get for free with P5.js is now that we've put our options, our choices into an array, we have pattern 1 and pattern 2. We can use random to randomly select a value that's been placed inside an array. So we can say choose a pattern at random from the array choices. So in processing, to do something like this, we would have to look at the length of choices. Then we would randomize in an index. We would create a random integer based on the size of the array, so an int between 0 and 1. Then we would use that integer as an index into the array choices to extract the pattern. With P5.js, you can just pass an array as a parameter to the random function, and then it will just kind of randomly choose an item inside the array and then return that to you. And that array could be numbers, could be colors, and in this case, it can also be functions. So this is a good example of how flexible JavaScript can be. It allows us to write things like this, where we can create an array of functions, then randomly choose from this array of functions to draw a pattern, right? And then we can define which of these pattern does just by putting some code inside these pattern 1 and pattern 2 functions. All right. So we're going to leave it at that for this lesson. So again, experiment, mess around with the code a little bit, change some things to see what happens. In the next and last tutorial for this week, we're going to build on this, and we're going to add multiple patterns. And we're also going to talk about just a slightly more advanced concept, where we're going to also add some probability of random selection, which means we're going to be able to bias the randomness towards one type of pattern or another. Currently, everything is 50-50, so there's an even chance that it will pick one or the other, and we'll work on adding some more flexibility to this program by adding some weights to the randomness. So that's one pattern could be picked more than the other. And we'll talk about that concept in the next lesson.